If you've survived a narcissist or a relationship that felt like one big mind game, you might not love to hear this, but there's a strength that you and that person are likely to share. And in this video, I'm going to explain that one strength, why you both probably have it in common, and where the real big differences start to show up. Because this strength may well be what brought you together, but the differences are what really matters. My name is Christina, and on this channel, we dive into the psychology and neuroscience behind emotional abuse, healing, and everything in between. The one strength you may share with a narcissist is a high level of cognitive empathy. So you're probably very good at reading other people and understanding in an instant why they react the way they do. But here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly, a little confusing if you don't know the differences. So there's a really big gap in between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy. And then there's something we call compassion, which is a different thing entirely. And understanding these distinctions can be a real big game changer. You see, cognitive empathy is like an intellectual understanding, where you can see someone's pain, for example. Emotional empathy is when you relate to and share in someone else's feelings. And this is the big difference between you and a narcissist, because they have high levels of cognitive empathy, but they're lacking in emotional empathy. And compassion is more than just that understanding or feeling. It's caring enough to want to help, which combines a cognitive understanding with an emotional feeling. And it can be really difficult to understand how some people can be so strong in one type of empathy and so incredibly weak in another. But if you're here, you know someone can deeply understand your pain and still make the choice to exploit it. So let's talk about how this cognitive empathy actually shows up in real life for you. So you're probably really good at sensing the vibe in any room, and probably even better than most people you know. You might pick up on subtle body language changes and maybe a tiny shift in someone's tone of voice or the tiniest little flicker in their eyes. These are things that all go into intuition. So if you're relating to this at all, or if you're even relating to having good intuition, you're definitely going to be picking up on some of these things. And you just know when something is off, sometimes before anyone else does. And this skill allows you to quickly figure out what people are thinking and feeling, and maybe even guess what they might do next. It's kind of like having a superpower for social situations. But here's where that gift can become a real problem, especially in relationships where one person isn't operating from a place of good intention. If you've been in a relationship with a narcissist, for example, your cognitive empathy can turn into a kind of hyper-awareness. You find yourself constantly walking on eggshells, right? You're always scanning the environment, always trying to predict the next outburst or the next argument. So you start predicting conflict, and then you start trying to prevent it. And all too often, this kind of prevention looks like self-minimizing. So you might quiet your own needs or bottle up your feelings, all in an effort to keep the peace. And the biggest warning sign here is when your ability to read others leaves you feeling overly responsible for their emotions and or their behavior. You see, your ability to understand can actually trick you into believing that it is your job to manage someone else's outbursts or emotional state. And now, thinking about your own life and past relationships, does this pattern sound at all familiar to you? So now to address the elephant in the room. How did you and the narcissist both end up with the same superpower? Well, it doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Cognitive empathy usually develops through intense practice, especially when there's a lot on the line. So think of it this way. There are typically two main paths that lead to becoming really good at reading other people. One path is forged in the fires of unpredictable or even unsafe relationships, where understanding someone's mood swings or their hidden agenda is key to your actual survival. And the other path involves being frequently rewarded for social performance or being able to control social situations. But in both cases, your brain learns that knowing what makes others tick is a huge advantage, just for different reasons. So let's take a look at each path, starting with the path that you might relate to most, the path of hypervigilance. So if you grew up in an unstable environment, maybe with a lot of neglect, or with a parent who was volatile, or struggling with addiction, you quickly learned an important lesson. Prediction equals safety. You learned that if you could just predict what was going to happen next, you could protect yourself. And this meant becoming incredibly good at scanning your environment for the tiniest cues. So this state of hypervigilance, it really sharpens your cognitive empathy to a pretty extraordinary degree. But living in this constant state of threat comes at a huge personal cost. You learn to prioritize other people's needs and feelings over your own, sometimes to the point where your own needs become almost invisible to you. And this also blurs your boundaries and sometimes makes you feel responsible for other people's emotions. So that's the hypervigilant path to this superpower. Now let's look at the other path that leads to high cognitive empathy. And this is what I call the control learning pathway. For some people, they learn pretty early on that being charming, impressive, or even dominant can get them what they want. And when there's no emotional empathy to create a connection or no real accountability for their actions, that cognitive empathy becomes a very strategic tool. And it's a tool they use to manage outcomes. So instead of feeling with you, they're understanding you to figure out how to get you to do something. And this can show up as someone mimicking your desires to appear aligned with you. So that mirroring that we see so often with narcissists. Or it can be a subtle exploitation of your vulnerabilities because they understand exactly which buttons to push. So we've talked about how this ability to deeply understand others, this cognitive empathy, gets built. But here's the difference between someone who uses it for good and someone who uses it to harm or for selfish reasons. It's not about whether you can read people. It's about what you do with that understanding. The skill itself, cognitive empathy, it's neutral, but the intention behind it, whether to foster connection or exert control, completely changes the outcome. So let's talk about the empath who uses their cognitive empathy because they really just want connection and peace. The dark side of this is that it becomes very easy to lose yourself when you are desperately trying to use your cognitive empathy to form connection. But here's the really, really good news. Healing doesn't mean that you lose your superpower. Instead, you learn to refine it. So what happens when this keen understanding of others, this cognitive empathy that we're talking about, is used not for connection, but for something darker? That underlying shame we talked about drives a deep-seated need for control and a complete avoidance of accountability. To them, being wrong isn't just like a simple mistake, like oops. It's a catastrophic threat to their entire self-image. Their cognitive empathy means that they can articulate your pain and they can describe your feelings with chilling precision. But they simply refuse to change anything about their own behavior. Why would they? Because their empathy completely vanishes the moment it requires any personal cost. And this is why their apologies so often feel hollow if they even apologize. And it's why the same problematic patterns keep showing up. Okay, so both empaths and narcissists are incredibly good at understanding others. I mean, really picking up on what makes people tick, right? So what happens when these two actually connect in a relationship? You might think it would be amazing for two people who are both really tuned into each other's emotions to be in a real relationship. But if you're here, I'm guessing you know where this is actually going. So typically, it starts with a super powerful, almost instant connection. You might feel like finally someone sees me, like truly sees the real you deep down. And it's an amazing feeling, especially for empaths who often feel misunderstood. But this lays the groundwork for what we call the love bombing phase. And this is when the narcissist, who was incredibly in tune to the needs and emotions of the empath, they meet those needs better than anyone can because they sense them. And this creates a sense of closeness that happens incredibly fast, much faster than it would naturally happen otherwise. But here's where things start to go sideways. Both of you are super attuned to each other, picking up on every little detail, but you're doing it for completely different reasons. The empath is looking for closeness. They want a true partnership. And the narcissist is using their understanding to get control. So one is purely self-motivated, and the other is purely motivated by connection. It's a fundamental mismatch that creates a recipe for a push-pull, hot and cold kind of dynamic. And that amazing feeling that comes and goes becomes something that you start to chase. So you'll have these moments of intense connection, and then bam, distance, criticism, or maybe you just feel ignored. And that on again, off again pattern actually trains the empath to keep trying harder. You start questioning yourself and you invest even more, even when the other person, who clearly sees your pain, keeps that painful cycle going. So how do we use this superpower without getting tangled up with a narcissist? That's the million-dollar question, right? Well, the answer isn't to turn it off entirely. Your sensitivity is not the problem. It's the lack of protection around your sensitivity that can cause some issues. So you don't need to turn off your cognitive empathy. You just need to turn it into a shield instead of a vulnerability. So the first way you can do that is to always cross-reference. You can ask yourself, does this person's words match their actions over time? Manipulative people are great at saying one thing and doing another. And your cognitive empathy can allow you to spot this inconsistency really fast. You probably have even noticed signs early on, or just had a feeling that something was off. And the lesson that we here have all learned the hard way is never to override your inner sense of knowing, just because you want to believe what the person is saying. And so then when something feels off, or you feel that pull to fix or intervene, just take a pause, take a minute. You don't have to react right away. This slight delay allows your rational mind to catch up and evaluate whether you're acting in your own best interests or stepping into someone else's emotional quicksand. And be sure to clearly state your boundaries using simple, direct language. So when someone pushes back or tries to blame you, try to avoid arguing or over-explaining, even though that feels incredibly difficult to do in the moment. It's really important to do it. And you can say something like, I'm not comfortable with that discussion right now. Healthy people are willing to repair and listen to your boundaries, and manipulative people see your boundaries as obstacles to overcome. So how someone responds to your boundaries says a lot about which type of person they are. And sometimes the best strategy is to just walk away from the conversation. You don't need to win anything or to have the last word. And if you walk away feeling drained, confused, or guilty when you have nothing to feel guilty about, that's also important feedback. If you pay attention to those things, those feelings will tell you when someone is trying to catch you in one of those manipulative loops. So does having high cognitive empathy mean you're on the path to becoming like a narcissist? Unfortunately, absolutely not. It does not mean that. The big difference isn't about the skill itself, but how someone uses it. So it's all about compassion, caring, and being accountable. A narcissist might understand your pain, but refuse to change their behavior. And you, with that very same understanding, will work towards connection and fairness. And listen, it's completely natural to feel unsure of your own judgment if your sensitivity has been taken advantage of. But this was never your fault. Narcissists are harder to spot than most people realize, especially the covert type. And there are reasons you didn't walk away sooner. So watch this video right here to learn more about how the covert narcissist flies under the radar. And be sure to like this video if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.